Today we are going to have a talks on new assessment of North Korean threat. And I didn't expect this many audiences today. Okay, that's a lie. I expect a room full of audience with the speakers on this issue. So I would be sad if I don't see many of you today. The issue is very important, and even last week there was several congressional hearings about North Korean threats from the Admiral Haney, General Scarpelli, and General Locklear, Admiral Locklear. They all talk about North Korean threat and how it imposed, what kind of threats were imposed by North Koreans to the United States and as well as its allies and partners in Northeast Asia. So I'm glad that I can have the speakers at this caliber today. And the reason why we have this kind of meeting is that it's also very important for Korean policymakers and Korean audiences to understand how our U.S. counterpart think about North Korean threats. And another thing that I want to mention is that even though some of our speakers today have worked for the government, they are not the part of government anymore, so they can talk whatever they want freely. Yeah, maybe I want to someday represent my country, but on that day I will speak only boring things, the things that you already know what I'm going to say. So it's going to be very interesting today. And I very briefly introduce our speakers today. Right next to me is Dr. Daniel Chu. Dr. Daniel Chu is the Deputy Director at the Atlantic Council's Brand Scowcroft Center on International Security. Before joining Atlantic Council until November last year, he served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development in DoD. And next to him is Dr. Van Jackson. He's a visiting fellow at the Center for New American Security and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs fellow. And from 2002 to 2014, Dr. Jackson held positions in the Office of Secretary of Defense as a strategist and a policy advisor focused on the Asia Pacific, Senior Country Director for Korea, and Working Group Chair of the U.S. ROK Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. And very far from me is Dr. Shin Chang-hoon. He is a research fellow and the director of the Center for Global Governance at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. He had taught and also worked for various institutions in Korea, and one of the main purpose of his visiting this time to DC is to have a meeting for the Nuclear Security Summit. So he's going to tell us about the non-proliferation issue and how North Korea's nuclear program is perceived by international community as well as the US and South Korea. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Dr. Chu to give us remarks.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much. It's very good to see such a good turnout here. Thank you for inviting me to speak here, and it's a great privilege to be able to speak at the same place as Van and Dr. Shin. I think we'll have a very good discussion. I want to make a few comments up front, but I'm looking forward to the discussion, and I thought I'd start just with a little bit of context, some of which has been said, but I think is worth emphasizing. First, a little personal context. So I'm now at the Atlantic Council, but I was previously the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development. That means my job was doing strategic planning or long-term planning and analysis for the Secretary of Defense. So my perspective on issues in the Pentagon, and continuing to this day, is largely in the longer-term time frame and in a global perspective rather than on a specific regional perspective. And you'll hear that reflected in my comments today. In particular, when I was at the Pentagon, my job was to link strategy to resources in other words, to ensure that the budgeting that we did in the Pentagon actually met our long-term interests as well as our near-term operations. Balancing regional and global concerns. While we are structured as a government in regional offices, it's important to take a global perspective on issues as the U.S. Continues to seek to lead at a global level. And also balancing near-term and long-term objectives. As I've suggested already, there is a need to ensure that resourcing is done appropriately across both of those timeframes. My office was primarily responsible for documents like the 2010 QDR, the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance, and the 2014 QDR, Quadrennial Defense Review, as well. So that said, you can tell I'm going to take a very broad perspective to this, hopefully still important in setting the context for our discussion today. But I'll defer some of the specifics on both North Korea's threat and on the U.S.-ROC alliance to the many specialists, some of whom I know are in the room, and including my friend Van Jackson, who worked this issue rather extensively in the Pentagon in his career as well. The other thing to reiterate is I am no longer in government, so these views represent my own, but I'm glad to give you my perspective on current government policy and strategy. Next, let's put things in what I would call the current context. Current events have largely been focused on Europe and the Middle East. If you watch CNN or any of the other cable news channels, you'll know that Russian aggression in Europe has become an issue of great concern, and hopes for collaborating with Russia have faded, and concerns about a revanchist Russia grow. Competing for airtime with Russia is the Middle East, as hopes for the so-called Arab Spring begin to fade, and concerns with the horrors of ISIS over ISIL and the growing sense of long-term instability in the region grow. As a result, people have increasingly questioned whether the U.S. rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region remains in place as per the 2012 DSG, where we first raised this as part of our strategy and reiterated it in the 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review, which came out only a year ago. Rebalance, the rebalance has been a phrase that we've heard a lot. Pivot back to Europe, and all sorts of other variants on the rebalance and pivot labels have been used. Despite this talk, however, I believe strongly that the U.S. interest and commitments to the rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region remain strong, in part because of strong, ongoing, and long-term national interests, but perhaps more importantly, because of global interests. The global economy that provides the prosperity, the support, that supports the growth and stability around the world, and on which our global peace and stability depends on, is born by the Asia-Pacific region. Let's remember what the rebalance was and is. A whole of government effort, not just a military rebalance. A rebalance while maintaining focus on areas like the Middle East and Europe. Those are perhaps the most forgotten words of the 2012 Defense Strategic Guidance. And recognition of potential changes in the overall strategic environment going as far back as 2011 and 2012. Let's be clear, however, that the current challenges we face with Russian aggression and instability in the Middle East are absolutely critical, and they may factor into the execution of our national strategy, particularly in terms of near-term and longer-term emphasis of actions. They do not, however, fundamentally change the importance of the Asia-Pacific region to the United States or to the world in the long run. In fact, the rebalance may be a critical part of managing a revanchist Russia and eventually managing stability in the Middle East region as well. As such, North Korea in particular continues to be a priority concern for the United States at a number of levels. First, and most immediately, North Korea is a clear and present danger to the Republic of Korea, one of our closest allies in the region and the world. Despite some initial hopes for opportunities to improve relations with the ascension of Kim Jong-un, North Korean words and actions have continued to raise both immediate and longer-term concerns for security on the Korean Peninsula. In fact, these concerns have broadened to include the increasing range of provocations that North Korea has shown a willingness to engage in both on and off the peninsula, in particular in the cyber realm, as we've seen recently. Of particular concern are the risks of escalation based on these provocations and the implications for others in the region. Second, North Korea serves as a destabilizing force in the Asia-Pacific region, creating tensions for and between the Republic of Korea, Japan, and China, in particular with Russia beginning to play a greater role as Putin seeks ties with Kim to offset his own isolation in Europe. Given the concentration of strategic and economic interests in Northeast Asia, this kind of instability threatens broad U.S. interests as well as, again, global economic interests. Finally, At the global level, instability based on provocations, military threats, risks of proliferation, and ongoing involvement in transnational criminal activities threaten the interests of U.S. and allies and partners around the world. As such, there is a broad international consensus that the North Korean threat must be deterred and the pathway to peaceful resolution on the peninsula must be enhanced. I believe that this means an emphasis in three areas going forward. First, continuing to improve and enhance the U.S.-ROC alliance. The last quadrennial defense review emphasized in particular the importance of working more closely with allies and partners. This couldn't be more important in any region, in any place, than with the U.S.-ROC alliance. This is already one of the closest alliances the U.S. has, especially with regard to planning. There is no other ally we plan with as closely or in as much detail as we do with the ROCs. However, we can do more. First, we can broaden our planning to include a wider range of contingencies, including, in particular, preparing for provocations that could lead to significant conflict, to help deter them, and most importantly, to manage escalation if necessary. Second, we can plan at a more strategic level to take into account changing North Korean doctrine and broader regional implications over the longer term for U.S.-ROC alliance. Finally, we can work closely together on collaborating on defense innovation to ensure that both the U.S. and the Republic of Korea have the appropriate capabilities for future challenges. In the second broad set, we can plan and act with broader whole-of-government approaches between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea that may include others in the region, especially Japan and China. Recognizing that there are long-standing tensions that still need to be looked at, we need to look forward as we address historic concerns in dealing with North Korea. Third, we need to recognize that in a globalized context, North Korean behavior is indeed a global concern. We need to bring in more voices to reinforce the importance of international laws, rules, and norms, as well as consequences. North Korea does not just threaten the Republic of Korea, nor the region. North Korea threatens global order. In particular, I see the need for our European partners to be more visible and vocal on these areas of concern. This is actually one of the reasons I joined the Atlantic Council. We're undertaking an effort to engage in more what we call Atlantic-Pacific partnerships to further enhance the rebalance to Asia-Pacific and contribute to the peace, stability, and prosperity in the region for the global economy. So it's tempting in this age of instant information to swing our attention to the issues of the day. In some cases, this is useful and even necessary in the near term. But we must keep our eyes on both near-term crises and longer-term objectives and interests. A strategy based on crisis management is likely only to produce more crises. A strategy that balances near-term responses with longer-term efforts and objectives may be more difficult to articulate, may be more difficult to execute, but it will be essential in succeeding in this complex and dynamic global security environment. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Ben, please.
So, thanks for coming. I wish that what I have to say would be the opinion of the U.S. government, but unfortunately it's not. So if you take away nothing else from what I'm about to say, it's that North Korea's ability to coerce and to wage violence is changing. It's not as it once was. And we're moving in a direction toward a future where limited war campaign scenarios are more likely than they've been previously. Everybody knows North Korea's nuclear and ballistic missile programs have been allowed to grow and improve over time. What's interesting isn't how many nuclear weapons North Korea has, how many it will have, plutonium versus uranium-based weapons, when its next nuclear test will be. All of these things matter. What's far more interesting to me, and what's far more debatable, frankly, is North Korea's nuclear posture, right? So how North Korea views its own nuclear weapons program, how it might use these nuclear weapons, and how it would affect its warfighting and foreign policy decision-making. So there are three major arguments for how we are told we're supposed to understand North Korea's nuclear program. The first, coming out in the 90s, is that North Korea's nuclear program is a bargaining chip. So if you offer a sweet enough deal with sufficient security, they will trade away their nuclear program. It exists to be traded for security. The second argument is that North Korea's nuclear weapons program is intended to be catalytic. So it has nuclear weapons so that it can scare China into protecting it, to bring China into a Korea conflict on North Korea's side. And then a third argument about North Korea's nuclear weapons program is that, and this is the most popular explanation, I think, is that it's intended for asymmetric escalation. This is what North Korea's own rhetoric says quite often. They try to convince us, and many are persuaded, that North Korea is willing to entertain the possibility of a nuclear first strike to escalate a conventional crisis or a conventional conflict to the nuclear level for the sake of deterrence. So deterring the alliance from either a retaliatory strike or deterring regime change. So I would offer three observations. The first being that pretty much all of these arguments, more or less, are wrong. North Korea's nuclear weapons program is pretending to exist for the sake of asymmetric escalation, but it's moving toward an assured retaliation capability, which is a different type of posture. Second, as North Korea moves closer to an assured retaliatory strike capability, there are several implications that the alliance needs to attend to, the foremost being the prospect of limited war scenarios, so limited scope military campaigns. Military fights, in effect, that are not trying to unify the peninsula, that are not trying to occupy everything. If North Korea actually achieves a secure retaliatory strike capability and relations with North Korea remain hostile as they've been, but North Korea will have fewer constraints and more opportunities to launch not just provocations as we've seen the last few years, but something more. This is what I'm talking about with limited scope military campaigns. And the third observation I have about all of this is that it's quite plausible that I'm completely wrong. But I think it is true. I think that this is the right thing to focus on, though. This is a debate that is not really being had, right? How does North Korea see its nukes? What is it for? That matters just as much as how many it has, right? Or when the next test is. So this is important, and it's not sufficiently debated. So even if I'm wrong, I'm glad that we can have a discussion about this. And so I'm arguing that these dominant approaches to understanding North Korea's nuclear program are wrong. Why would I say that? On what basis am I saying that, right? So the bargaining chip hypothesis is, I think, short of reality in at least three respects, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. The forum for negotiating the elimination of nuclear weapons, six-party talks, North Korea has declared it dead. You know this. Nuclear weapons are enshrined in North Korea's constitution. They've assigned themselves status as a nuclear state. The document that says who they are as a people now includes self-recognition as a nuclear state. That's hard to walk back. It's possible, but it's very hard. And most importantly, North Korea is putting money where their mouth is. They're continuing over time to invest money, labor, time in building out their nuclear and their missile programs. If you're just going to trade it away, why continue to invest in it? Why you can keep it hot without throwing a lot of resources at it. So all of these things suggest to me that the bargaining chip explanation for North Korea's nuclear program is not presently the most plausible explanation. The catalytic argument about North Korea's nukes, that they're intended to seem scary to China so that China will come in to try to stabilize the situation as a protector of North Korea, I think is a misreading of geopolitics in the region. The reality is that the Sino-North Korean relationship is bad, and it's been bad for a while. it's a distant relationship. It's weak, and over the last 5 years or so, North Korea has seemingly been antagonistic toward China repeatedly. And instead of moving closer to China, which is what you would expect if North Korea was seeking a sort of great power patron, they're diversifying away from Beijing, moving closer to Moscow, as Dan mentioned. And so this suggests to me that North Korea does not see China as a reliable ally, and its nukes do not exist for the sake of bringing China into a situation to stabilize it. The third view of North Korean nukes, that they're intended for asymmetric escalation. So this is possible. It seems like this is what North Korea wants us to believe. But they're making nuclear and missile and other investments that I'm not sure are necessary if they intended their foreign policy to be solved through threats of nuclear escalation. So what do I mean? North Korea's development of the KN-08 road mobile ICBM and its fixed missile facilities, so like geographically fixed, that is sufficient for a nuclear posture of asymmetric escalation. That is all you would need. Yet, North Korea is also developing SLBMs. It's also modernizing its conventional force, so it's non-nuclear force. So these are things that are not necessary if your posture, if your nuclear, your like theory of victory for your nuclear posture is asymmetric escalation, the threat of raising conflict to the nuclear level for the sake of deterrence. So what explanation can account then for the KN-08 and the fixed missile facilities and SLBMs and a bunch of advanced capability, anti-ship cruise missiles, drones, and modernizing the conventional force? What can account for all of that? I would offer that the most likely explanation is that North Korea, regardless of what it says, wants to achieve an assured retaliatory nuclear capability, so that no matter what we do, they have in reserve the ability to strike back with a nuclear weapon. To get to that point, there are a couple things that need to happen. North Korea needs to grow its nuclear missile arsenal, right? Its actual inventory, which it seems like it's on track for. It needs to diversify the types of delivery vehicles for nuclear payloads. And it needs to diversify the locations of those delivery vehicles, of its missiles. But all of that is what's happening today. So the things that are necessary conditions to move in the direction of an assured retaliation capability are happening, as far as I can tell. And so why does this matter? Well, if I'm right, then North Korea's nuclear weapons are designed to make total war impossible. They're designed to make an alliance-first strike against North Korea's nuclear facilities impossible. It doesn't mean that they're right, but that is the hope or the intention, right? And in the context of an assured retaliation capability, the advanced conventional capability investments that it's making sort of makes sense. If you have your own nuclear umbrella in theory, then you can't use it willy-nilly for for achieving military objectives. You need conventional capabilities to do that. You can't have an old rusty force doing that. You need something more modern, more usable. And so they're investing in realistic capabilities that could be used in limited military campaigns. Conventional campaigns, limited in scope, not signaling marching all the way to Busan, right? Like, this is not a repeat of 1950. And so over time, North Korea's nuclear program and its missile program and the way it's converging suggests that limited war scenarios are becoming far more realistic. Nothing's inevitable. Total war scenarios becoming much less realistic. Alliance first strike scenarios becoming much less realistic. Regime change scenarios becoming much less realistic. And even if you're not so sure about the limited war campaign point, put that aside, North Korea is clearly moving in a direction with its nuclear and its missile programs that will enable it to pursue various forms of provocation, as we've seen, without any kind of expectation of retaliation. It's not just that they're drawing inferences from our lack of response historically. Like, perhaps that's the case. I think that's partially the case. But it's also that North Korea is establishing over time a capability that sort of logically assures them that we won't be able to retaliate. So are we to that day yet? I'm not so sure about that, but that's the direction things are headed. So this is the trajectory we're on today. If nothing dramatically different happens, then I think limited war campaigns and provocations as a new normal, like the way they were in the 1960s, will be thrust upon us regardless of what we want. And that, I think, is the risk of continued patience, which is really a clever way of saying not doing much. So I'll leave it at that, and a great Q&A later. Thank you.
Thank you. Please have a seat.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, actually, I'm not an expert on North Korea, fortunately, but I just came to Washington, D.C. to release draft articles on International Convention on Nuclear Security tomorrow in the National Press Club. But anyway, for these occasions, I'm very pleased to talk about the North Korea's threat. I mean, the new assessment of North Korea's threat in this meeting. Well, actually, Dr. Chu mentioned North Korean threats from the perspectives of global perspectives of strategy. And Dr. Van Jackson told us, the importance, the significance of nuclear posture of North Korea. Well, especially with regard to Dr. Van Jackson's argument, some of my arguments is complementing each other, but some of my arguments is conflicting with each other. And when it comes to the Dr. Chu's presentations, I think probably my observations on North Korea's attitude would be, a little bit conducive to shaping a new strategy with regard to North Korea's threat. My observation, I just jotted down the 8 observations. So the 8 observations was already distributed as in the form of a printed version. So my first observation is about North Korea's weapons for asymmetric warfare. Weapons of mass destruction and its delivery system, cyber attacks and drone invasion constitute major tools for North Korea's waging of asymmetric warfare. So they will be a significant future threat to South Korea, United States, as well as the US-ROK alliance, and even regional and international peace and security. But as you know, emerging technology also plays a significant role in North Korea's play with asymmetry. When it comes to the development of emerging technologies such as information and communication technology and drone, North Korea is far behind any other players in the region. But we should pay special attention to the fact that North Korea has no self-imposed limitations in using or threatening to use them. For instance, North Korea does not care about peacetime or wartime or civilian or critical infrastructure in government. Its underdeveloped technology in information and communication technology and drone, I think paradoxically strengthens its position when using or threatening to use them, particularly in peacetime. And their use, may not be considered as a state level armed attack. For instance, well, if you look at the precedents such as cyber attacks on South Korea's news media and banks in 2013, drone invasion in 2014, and hacking the Sony and the Korean hydro and nuclear power company at the end of 2014. My second observation is about North Korea's risk-taking attitude. North Korea's risk-taking entity in nature. I think North Korea is good at intentionally taking risk and instability, and even enjoys the risk and stability. This kind of attitude becomes more, often the case under the Kim Jong-un's regime, I think. When calculating the risk of the North Korea's nuclear weapons, the level of probability does not matter. So North Korea is ready to plan for the unthinkable and surprise attacks. So sometimes, Dr. Von Jackson said, North Korea's the use of nuclear weapons would be confined to the limited, areas, but sometimes North Korea will do this kind of, surprise attacks when they feel, there is no way to survive in crisis. And my third observation is a symmetrical vulnerability of South Korea to any military provocations from North Korea. In the case of the escalation of tensions, particularly with South Korea, North Korea is deft in dominating escalations. The three tools, as I already mentioned, have made contribution to the dominance. This is not because North Korea has more power or capability than South Korea, but because of the asymmetrical vulnerability of South Korea to any military provocation from North Korea. Because South Korea is connected to the global community. For instance, if you look at the information technologies, South Korea's network is totally connected to the networks of outside world. But in case of North Korea, their networks are not totally connected to the globe. So this creates asymmetrical, vulnerability as well. This explains why North Korea is inclined to lean on brinkmanship. And my fourth observation is about North Korea's calculation of demonstration effect of their asymmetrical power. It is well known that in the real world, nuclear tests have created a demonstration effect. But however, in case of the cyber attacks, the demonstration effect has not been so compelling, because the pattern of the cyber attacks is really secretive in nature. It is doubtful if the previous three nuclear tests conducted by North Korea has created some demonstration effects as expected in terms of the scale. Unlike in the cyber attacks against South Korea's news media and banks in 2013, in case of the Sony hacking and the Korea hydro and nuclear power plants company hacking, the attacks were really destructive. So it creates a more, demonstration effect than nuclear test. But this is not comparable we cannot go parallel with this kind of comparison. But however, normally speaking, I mean, the cyber attacks has created more demonstration effect. And drone invasion, for instance, in 2014 also have created a similar demonstration effect, particularly in South Korea. So South Korea paid a lot of costs for coping with this kind of demonstration effect. And cyber attacks and drone invasions were more, in that sense, I mean, cost-effective than nuclear tests. So North Korea's attitude cannot be easily estimated or predicted with common sense. And my fifth observation is about human factors. I think, human factors worsens the instability on the Korean Peninsula. And the mindset of North Korean leaders with regard to nuclear weapon is also changing. So we need a cautious approaches, different approaches to the Kim Jong-un's nuclear posture, I think. For instance, Kim Il-sung saw the serious, humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons in World War II. He was seriously concerned about the possibility of the use of nuclear weapons by the United States during the Korean War. And Kim Jong-il made his best efforts to realize the possession of nuclear weapons for the purpose of regime survival. He witnessed what happened if a state abandoned its WMD programs, particularly the Libyan case might have provided to him an adverse lesson on the voluntary abandonment of WMD programs. However, to Kim Jong-un, the current leader in North Korea, nuclear weapons were just inherited items. They were not acquired, the nuclear weapons were not acquired by his efforts. This may have created a peculiar mindset different from his grandfather and father regarding his nuclear policy or posture. Kim Jong-un moves towards, no exit in his nuclear policy. For instance, in order to institutionalize its nuclear status, North Korea revised its constitutional law on 13 April 2012 that added a reference to North Korea as nuclear state in the preamble. On the 1st of April in 2013, North Korea passed a law on consolidating the position of nuclear weapon state for self-defense. You may find very significant elements of nuclear posture from this law. And the execution of Jang Song-pak puts serious suspicion on the volatile character of the current supreme leader Kim Jong-un in North Korea. So I think, good or proven judgment cannot be expected in crisis situation. We need to pay attention to the report by Chatham House. It was released, in April last year, titled Too Close for Comfort, which deals with near use of nuclear weapons. So, in accordance with this report, human factors is much more important than actual nuclear capabilities. And my sixth observation is about unclear position of North Korea about no first use doctrine. As I already illustrated the law passed the law on consolidating the position of nuclear weapon state for self-defense. It contains a lot of significant implications for North Korean nuclear posture. In accordance, with the interpretation of this law, we can throw some questions like this. Is it true that North Korea decided to possess nuclear weapons for the purpose of self-defense or just deterrence? But what is clear is that North Korea has no dominance at all in number and technology of its nuclear weapons over the US. The dominance is just only over South Korea in the region, I think. A symmetrical vulnerability becomes bigger in South Korea than in the United States. But interestingly, the threats to use its nuclear weapons has been thrown to the United States rather than to South Korea after Kim Jong-un took his office. Will it be effective strategy for North Korea? And as Mr. Terence rightly pointed out, North Korea opts for counter-value strategy that targets South Korean or Japanese cities along with US military bases in South Korea and Japan. He also pointed out that North Korea's nuclear force is too small and insufficiently accurate to use for a first strike that seeks to disarm an adversary through a counter-force strategy. I think, North Korea prefers counter-value strategy to counter-force strategy at the moment. However, this does not necessarily opt out a first-use doctrine vis-a-vis South Korea. So we may think of the disguised intention. So disguised intention may exist. North Korea's real intention is to use all its nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula. I think it's kind of bluffing or threat, psychological threat, or possibly in Japan with first-use doctrine. If so, China's national security will be more in danger than that of the United States, I think. Considering geographical proximity, any use of nuclear weapons in Korean peninsula may have serious humanitarian consequences to some part of mainland China. And my seventh observation is North Korean nuclear weapons and materials are not manageable. The United States and Russia may view North Korea's nuclear issue as manageable when considering the number of warheads, the quantity of nuclear materials, technological development, and geographical proximity. However, South Korea and Japan have never viewed the issue as manageable. China, in case of China is a little bit hedging between manageable and unmanageable. But China should take into consideration the following, observations, following features. North Korea's counter-value strategy, not counter-force strategy. Humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. Radiological impact on mainland China. And proliferation of miniaturized nuclear weapons, such as gun-type uranium atomic bomb, and smuggled nuclear materials, probably from Russia to the terrorists in China. And North Korea's overt targeting at the U.S., as I already mentioned, is disguised intention. North Korea's overt targeting at the U.S. may be a smokescreen tactic to make the U.S. view the issue as just manageable. Just one drop of nuclear weapons to Seoul in South Korea would be catastrophic, so that the ripple effects of this may have significant consequences to the U.S. national interests it is, I mean, indirect, so that, I mean, policymakers in the United States may think, well, the nuclear issue in North Korea is very remote question. My eighth observation, my last observation, is about no withhold target set. If you already witnessed that North Korea shelled Yeonpyeong Island, so there was so many, I mean, civilian victims. Before that, South Korean people believed that North Korea will not attack civilians because they are brother. But this kind of mentality has been totally, I mean, changed due to the, I mean, Yeonpyeong Island shelling. So when planning to use nuclear weapons or to carry out cyber attacks, it showed that North Korea has no withhold target set. The Sony hacking and the KHMP hacking showed that North Korea's cyber attack also took the counter-value strategy. So North Korea prefers counter-value strategy to counter-force strategy. It is evident, I think. So if I conclude my talks, I think, well, the best way to, I mean, make North Korea abandon is to, I mean, show the nuclear, I mean, deliver the nuclear, North Korea's nuclear posture to the public and to the policymakers in other countries. So I think, well, a certain dialogue to clarify North Korea's nuclear doctrine among the stakeholders is compelling. And we have to keep trust on the efficacy of sanctions as well. And we have to bear in mind that there is no way to rectify and overcome the asymmetric vulnerability of South Korea to any military provocations from North Korea. And I mean, strengthening, in order to cope this kind of, I mean, vulnerability, I mean, I think strengthening offensive capability just may escalate tensions. So South Korea, just while increasing offensive capability, cannot dominate escalation at all. Good and prudent judgment cannot be expected because of the volatile character of North Korea's supreme leader. So the human errors may facilitate a surprise attack from North Korea. So that is why I think denuclearization and the strengthening the defense is the only option for the stability in the Korean Peninsula. So that's why, I mean, the missile defense system can be understood in this context. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairman. And I'm going to use my privilege as a moderator to ask questions first, because I'm afraid that all the good questions were asked by our audience before I ask any questions today. First, Dan, you know that there is a very heated debate about that deployment in Korea these days, especially by Chinese officials visit to South Korea. So I'm going to ask you two questions, and let alone like Chinese reaction to that deployment. One of the discrepancies between Korea and the U.S. about this issue is the perceived level of North Korea's ballistic missile capability and the threat posed by it. So how serious does the United States take this issue for U.S. national security and also the regional security in Korea? And there are still suspicion, not only from China and in some Koreans, that U.S. BMD system is not just targeting against North Korea's ballistic missile capability, but maybe in the long run, U.S. is trying to use this BMD system against China.
So let me start with the second question first. To the extent China is concerned that US BMD systems, or more importantly, allied BMD systems, have any implications for China beyond the North Korea threat, frankly, to me, that should be all the more incentive for China to work with us to address the North Korean threat. Without a North Korean threat there, we can talk about the future of missile defense, but right now it's entirely unproductive to talk about what else it may be for, given the nature of the North Korean threat, which I think helps answer at least my perspective on the first question. I don't think there's a lot of daylight between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea on the threat of North Korean missiles, both from a tactical operational sense and from a strategic sense, some of which has been addressed by the potential implications of the coercive use of this missile capability by the North Koreans. These are absolutely critical capabilities to neutralize. And missile defense is certainly one of the key elements of that. More importantly, an integrated missile defense system, which will work much better than any otherwise separate set of systems, will be key to making progress in this area. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some progress on that in the near term.
Thank you. Ben, we discussed about your saying the limited war campaign scenarios and limited scope military campaigns. So is there any specific scenarios that do you think North Korea is capable of doing it? And second question is, let's say that if North Korea suddenly occupies one of the northern islands, and then
You just named the scenario.
that's one of it, and try to use their nuclear capability as deterring the Allied forces. What conclusion will you get?
Well, that's not a very good scenario. That's why I think it's important to bring attention to this possibility, though, because the sort of structural incentives of the situation in Korea are there. And so if this happens, shame on us that we hadn't imagined it previously. Either seizure or occupation or blockade of one or more of the Northwest Islands is at least possible. Some kind of amphibious or guerrilla scenario on the East Coast, possible. Seizure of small portions of territory on the South Korean side of the DMZ. All these things are possible. Many things are possible. The importance isn't the specific scenario, but thinking through a range of plausible scenarios and what that, back out of that, and then say, well, what does that mean for what we need to do? Does that make us think about deterrence differently? Do we need a different kind of alliance, kind of combined force structure? It's like, what kind of capabilities make the most or the least sense, given the range of plausible scenarios? So this is just something, to my knowledge, nobody's talking about really. We think about total war, we think about collapse. We don't think about much in between. Recently, we started thinking about one-off isolated provocations since 2010. But what happens if there's escalation following a provocation? You end up in limited war. Do you think if there's escalation from a provocation, that automatically means it has to be regime change or full unification of the peninsula? The costs and time involved make that, to me, seem not that likely. Again, anything's possible. So I think thinking about the possibility of limited war scenarios is reasonable. And from North Korea's perspective, surely they don't want total war, because they would, unless they're completely delusional, they would lose. They would know they would lose. So that means to the extent that they want to fight, it would have to be a limited fight. And so, I forgot, is that the, sorry.
So I mean the like limited war scenarios. So when one of the scenarios that one of the possible scenarios will happen, what would be the response?
Well, I don't want to punt on the question. I don't really know. But that's a concern.
So this is why my recommendation is that as an alliance, we work harder on planning for a broader range of contingencies. Now, we already do some of this in terms of what would generally be called branches and sequels of various types of planning. I think that's important, but I think we really need to look at these as distinctly different possibilities. Van calls them limited war scenarios. I call them provocation with the potential for escalation. I think however you categorize them, looking at them discretely as situations we need to look at, not only deterring, but managing the escalation should they occur. Looking at the specific types of capabilities and the types of responses both the U.S. and the ROC will need in order to manage these situations is quite critical. We have had a habit in the U.S. military, or the U.S. Department of Defense, I should say, of planning for the high end and assuming everything else is a lesser included contingency. And what I am at least arguing, and I think Van would at least in part agree with me, is not all of these are lesser included contingencies. Many of them have discrete criteria and characteristics that need to be addressed separately. More importantly, I think if we address this broader range of contingencies, not only will we be better prepared, but I think it will vastly improve the depth and the breadth of the U.S.-ROC relationship. It will really give us, some of these are going to reach into avenues, as I suggested before, that may be more whole-of-government approaches than purely military approaches. And I think this will really add to the relationship in a way that's quite critical going forward.
Chang-won, you mentioned about the nuclear doctrine of North Korea. Forgive my ignorance of these issues. Does it conflict with like our policy of not accepting North Korea as a nuclear weapon state, or not recognizing as a nuclear weapon state, if we require them to declare their nuclear doctrine?
Theoretically, or in accordance with international laws, especially with regard to NPT regime, North Korea cannot be considered as a nuclear weapon state. So I think, well, the discussion on the nuclear posture or the nuclear doctrine or the dialogues with North Korea with regard to nuclear posture or nuclear doctrine may provide North Korea certain misleading signals that international community recognize the nuclear weapon status of North Korea. But however, so this is, conflicting aspect when we are talking about the nuclear posture or nuclear operation doctrine. But however, I think in order to fully understand the real image of North Korea's nuclear capability, I think, well, the clear, understanding of nuclear posture and nuclear doctrine is, necessary. So in that sense, well, the discussions on the nuclear posture and nuclear doctrine is not that much conflicting with any nuclear policy, which does not, recognize North Korea as nuclear weapon state.
Thank you. We have microphone, right? So if you have questions, even though I know most of you, please identify yourself with your name and affiliation, please.
Tom Carrico, CSIS. My question is in two parts, one for Van Jackson, one for Daniel Chu. And Van, I heard you say that the third of the three alternatives you don't like to explain North Korea. The third one is asymmetric escalation. And the reason that you conceded that, as I heard you say, that's not the right way to characterize it, is really the diversity of delivery systems. NOA local systems fixed, and then also sea lives and some other things. And then you began to articulate what you prefer, this kind of limited war use scenario. My question is, why are those things so distinct? As I was listening to you, in a way it sounded more like an articulation, an elaboration, a thought, more imaginative way of thinking through it, as a kind of call it a third strike capability. You're saying first they act, then we react in some way. retain enough capability to really prevent us from being able to defeat. And I use the word defeat rather than deter them. I call future war deterrent defeat. And that really leads to the second half of that question, which leads from that for Daniel Chu, and that is the problem of thinking about these things as lesser included capabilities exactly is very thoughtful and on point. And in your private capacity, what are some of the things we should be thinking about that we don't have? Is it more F-35Cs? Is it more cruise missiles, for example? So when you get to that point, you need to defeat rather than deter. What might that look like?
So, great question. So, asymmetric escalation as an ideal type posture is just like definitely distinct, analytically distinct from an assured retaliation posture. There's no reason, in the messy real world that that North Korea would not be trying to pursue both. The thing that warns me off of an asymmetric escalation posture is it's a posture that prepares for the use of first strike. And so it's going nuclear first, whereas we're still on the conventional side or we haven't retaliated at all yet. And so the logic of nuclear first use is still, there's a debate about how rational is North Korea, and there are reasons, human factor reasons, Kim Jong-un, 20-something's hormones, that would suggest that maybe North Korea won't be so rational with its use of nuclear weapons. But if you look at North Korean behavior, just since Kim Jong-un has taken power, the rhetoric is more heated, right? But other than 2010, where's the lethality? We're very concerned about wildly irrational behavior, but the reality of unacceptably high costs, what is it in North Korea's mind that would most likely trigger regime change? If you're North Korea, that's the thing you want to avoid. And what's more high-end than nuclear use? So if I'm North Korea, nuclear use is the one thing that I would think would, maybe artillery shelling of Seoul, that would trigger the alliance actually trying to move north, actually trying to end North Korea's regime. And so if that's the case, then from North Korea's perspective, they have an incentive to make us believe asymmetric escalation is what they're willing to do under certain conditions, but the costs are so high that whether you believe it or not comes down to a debate about what you think of North Korea's rationality. But it is possible that North Korea could be developing a force that can do a first strike and then get retaliated against and then launch a second strike, in which case it would be assured retaliation plus asymmetric escalation. So that's possible. I just think that the costs that North Korea would be facing, or the risks that North Korea would be facing from using nukes first, is kind of unacceptably high. This is why it's debatable. This is why I'm sort of hedging and being like, I could be wrong, because I could be wrong. Yeah.
So I'm going to steal some of that question and then get to the one posed to me. I agree with Van. This is the right discussion to have. I disagree with him a little bit on how clearly he's delineated between the alternatives here. I think there is real possibility that it can be more than one. I think this delineation between use of nuclear weapons being so high as to trigger regime change is very much in our thinking. It is very much an old way of thinking where use of nukes was really above the threshold, far beyond anything conventional. I'm not positive that's the case today, and particularly on the peninsula.
Really?
I do too, but I will tell you, I worry very much that the whole point of an asymmetric use is to find a use that is below a threshold of a certain response. I think, quite frankly, again, speaking at a very broad strategic level, this is one of the biggest challenges the U.S. faces around the world today. Over the past 20 years, in particular in the first Gulf War, the United States has demonstrated its extreme dominance in conventional domains, and that has been well noticed by friend and foe alike around the world. As a result, those who are either true adversaries or potential adversaries have been looking at ways to circumvent those capabilities for some time, and we're seeing numerous examples of how that's done, both at the high end with significant A2AD type capabilities, at the lower end with various types of asymmetric insurgent type activities, and everywhere in between. Russia is inventing some new ways today. If I were North Korea at the very least, that's how I would be thinking about the use of nuclear weapons in that asymmetric realm. So I'm very concerned that, and I don't think that's, what's the word, irrational. I just think that's contextual, and I'm very concerned about how that plays out in that role. In which case, if I'm correct, and I don't argue I'm correct any more than Van does, it can be both asymmetric use and seeking a second strike, an assured second strike capability, because to some extent that's like a double bonus, seeking to get in under the wire if at all possible through some form of nuclear use, but also having in reserve an assured second strike capability, which hopefully from a North Korean perspective would deter even further involvement. Using that as kind of a setup to the question that you raised for me, so I see this full range of things that we have to be cautious about, and from things that we consider low-end provocations right now. My point in saying they're not lesser included contingencies is, right now, if we simply think we can respond to them in the same way we respond to, for example, a massive movement of North Korean artillery or armor, the escalation control aspect of that may be lost. So thinking about them very specifically in terms of how we respond to them and what capabilities we would need for them, to me, is what's really critical there. And frankly, in many of these provocation cases, this may have nothing to do with F-35's missile defense or other large, high-profile platforms. This may have to do with, for example, enhancing our ability to work with Iraqs on counter-SOF, enhancing our ability to do controlled movements of defensive forces to limit provocation, counter-provocation, if that makes sense, but to limit escalation, truly. What are those capabilities, and then what does that mean for our posture on the ground? Is a bigger ground footprint better for that, or is it actually a bigger target? I'm not arguing that it's necessarily one or the other, but these are the questions that we absolutely have to ask. Is more airstrike capability on PEN critical, or is the ability to flow more quickly to the peninsula more critical? These are the sorts of things that if you take one major scenario and do lesser included, you're going to get only one answer for it. On the other hand, if you do a variety of these and really break them down into the specifics, you get a range of answers, which I think will introduce some questions and trade-offs as we think about the future of posture and the future of exactly how the alliance integrates and works together. So I think that's really going to be critical in thinking about future capabilities and future posture.
Just a real quick two-finger. Agree with pretty much all of that. I just wanted to clarify, when I talk about nuclear use in these ideal type postures, I'm thinking of kinetic nuclear use in the counter force or counter value sense, so like blowing up people or buildings or something. There are also, there's a wide universe of possibilities of nuclear use that don't involve the kinetic use of a nuclear weapon, so alert signaling, electromagnetic pulse bursts. There's a lot of possibilities that actually may fit very well what Ken's talking about, even though I'm sure you were including kinetic.
Yeah, I was going to say, so I'm thinking, I agree with those, but I would also start to, if we have kind of a fuzzy gray zone of things that we're not sure what the necessary response is, I agree that those fall in them, but I worry about things like unconventional delivery of nuclear weapons. That's difficult to attribute, at least in a short period of time. Those, and not necessarily on peninsula, those sorts of things are going to be very, very challenging for us.
Mike Brzezinski, PBS Online NewsHour. The mantra of the United States and the international diplomatic world regarding North Korea is to keep talking about a denuclearized Korean peninsula. Based on what you folks are saying, that seems about as likely as the second coming of the Messiah a week from Sunday. Why do we keep using this expression? Because we don't have anything better to say, or if we changed our language it would scare people? And then the second point, more technical, on deterrence. Doesn't North Korea already possess enough conventional weaponry to at least destroy Seoul without going to the nuclear level?
I can grab the first one. So I recently had to grapple with this at a congressional hearing. But the distinction between saying that we are looking for a denuclearized Korean peninsula on the one hand, and on the other hand, our rhetoric and what we say and what we think about is clearly a North Korea as a sort of rogue nuclear state. This is a distinction between what's your diplomatic posture, what's your diplomatic policy, and whether you see value in granting North Korea some kind of international status or not, as compared to what do you do as a military planner or as a defense strategist. So if you know a capability exists, or if you have high confidence that a capability exists, it's prudent to plan against that. And that's a separate question from the question of do you grant status or recognition, or do you change what your sort of goal is. And so, at least how the Pentagon thinks about these things, there's sort of the regional policy and diplomatic nuance of what you say in public messaging and what your goals are, as compared to what you have to plan for, which is often things that are not even real, or at least not really yet. It's sort of worst case scenario thinking, for the sake of prudence.
When it comes to the diplomatic expression on the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, there has been interesting, debates in South Korea with regard to the use of terms. For instance, some U.S. officials called non-proliferation rather than denuclearization in South Korea. The South Korean media was really, perplexed because, non-proliferation is kind of, controlling the transfer of the nuclear materials or nuclear weapons. So it is not targeted, the ultimate goal is not denuclearization. So the sense of the Korean media is that U.S. is just abandoning the denuclearization policy on the Korean Peninsula. So, however, if you look at the non-proliferation treaty, only the 5 states can have the right to possess nuclear weapons. So based upon this kind of right, so non-proliferation also includes the denuclearization of North Korea. So, and another interesting debates in South Korea is that whenever we discuss the denuclearization issue with China, China always used the term denuclearization of Korean Peninsula, not North Korea. So South Korea was a little bit offended by this kind of, use of terms, because South Korea does not have any nuclear materials or nuclear weapons. So in the diplomatic world, I think, use of terms is really, in terms of art, and very cautious. We need very cautious approaches.
So let me start by saying I think the question on denuclearization falls in the category of can we walk and chew gum? And I think the answer is yes. I think there are going to be different levels that we have to address the North Korean situation. Certainly in the near term, addressing nuclear use and nuclear proliferation are absolute necessities, particularly for the Department of Defense, but in collaboration with others, both in the Interagency State Department in particular and with our ROC and other allies in the region. But having denuclearization as an ultimate objective, I think, can still remain. The main point I would make on that particular issue, though, is I don't think we should pretend in any way it's going to be in isolation, right? We're not going to leave the entire situation in place and somehow denuclearize North Korea. This has to be in a larger context. So this has to be through addressing this larger context, which I think is what we're all kind of touching various facets of here in this particular discussion. Your point on North Korean conventional capability is absolutely true. The North Koreans, as we all know, have enough artillery in place to do some serious damage to Seoul in a very short period of time. This has been a long-term concern of both the U.S. and the Republic of Korea, and has been the focus of our planning for quite some time. So it's not to say that that's not important. In fact, that has been one of the primary issues in the U.S. ROC alliance for some time. But the issue of asymmetric use of nuclear weapons, so the massive shelling of Seoul would be an overt, conventional, significant, clear act of war. There is no doubt about that, I think, on either side, on any side of this equation. And here I'm obviously hypothesizing as a potential scenario, but the unconventional delivery of a nuclear warhead off peninsula that is set off in a way that disrupts either U.S. alliances or U.S. flow of forces and creates significant difficulties in responding to any other kind of North Korean activity. That could be really problematic for us to assess how to respond to. The question for our South Korean allies would be, if it does not happen on Peninsula, whether they would react to that or not. A question for the United States might be, without clear and quick attribution, which we all know is technically difficult, but not impossible, what would the U.S. reaction would be and when? And what happens in the meantime is quite problematic. So while your premise is absolutely correct, it doesn't negate the fact that there are a number of things can be done at the nuclear level that actually create some concerns, which is why, although I like the clarity of Van's alternatives, I'm really worried about combinations of them going forward.
Van? Chris.
We're just thinking all I came out. Thanks so much, Chris Nelson. You know, this is endlessly fascinating and ultimately terrifying question, isn't it? Because we're really talking about under what circumstances would the North Korean regime commit suicide by actually using a nuke on people, you know, or territory. And so far, at least, they haven't done it. Even though we're pretty sure, respectful, is pretty sure they've at least nuclearized some nodons, if nothing else. But so I have sort of two questions. Are we agreed that actual use, North Korean use of nukes would itself be an act of regime suicide, that we would have to retaliate, and that would be it for them? Do we agree on that? Or are we, you know, is it iffy maybe? On the demonstration use, how would you get away from what's the next step if they're going to do that? Does that link up to this debate that we've been having about, you know, we're not negotiating with these guys anything now. We're not negotiating a cap on missiles. We're not negotiating a cap on testing. And they're just going to keep on producing, whether it's one warhead a year or what. You know, as we're reading these incredible stories like 50 or 100, you know, all this kind of stuff. At what point do they become undeterrable through implied blackmail? Are we missing what we really should be focusing on when we're talking about these, in a sense, more abstract questions of would they actually use these weapons and what would we do? At a certain point, the numbers per se become a use of them. So thanks.
I think, well, so I'm not resolved about this, but I think we might disagree about whether nuclear sort of kinetic use equals suicide. It is possible that I'm flanked by experts who believe that North Korea believes they could use nuclear weapons against military target or civilian target and still think that they would not face regime change. I think the costs are just so high that it's hard to contemplate traditionally. I agree, though, that circumstances are changing. The way states, especially sort of non-conforming states, view the nuclear taboo is clearly very different. So we can't just mirror image. So I would have reflexively said yes, nuclear use equals suicide, but there are persuasive cases to be made for the contrary.
Okay, yes. I also think yes, the use of nuclear weapon is a suicide to North Korea. But however, we have to think this kind of observation. Well, actually, in order to deter North Korea from using nuclear weapons, we have to show a clever method for retaliation. But however, I cannot find any, credible method for retaliation at the moment. So this creates, as I already told you, a symmetrical, vulnerability of South Korea and the RK South Korea alliance. So we have to think of this kind of issues.
Incredible, other than using our own nukes to wipe them out.
Well, I think there are other options, but and they're all credible in the sense that we certainly have the capabilities. So there's no doubt that if we wanted to, we could wipe North Korea out with our own nuclear weapons. There's also, I think, very little doubt that if we wanted to, we could take out the regime with conventional forces as well. So those issues are not in doubt. I think the issue that's in doubt is whether North Korea believes either of those responses would be triggered based on their nuclear use. And we have to be really careful now. We're lumping a lot of things into the term nuclear use. My own personal opinion is at a certain level of nuclear use, there should be no doubt, and I don't think we're giving them much doubt, that if they nuke a major city, if they nuke a major base, these sorts of things, that's clearly going to result in a retaliation that's unacceptable to them. I don't think they have a lot of doubt about that. I do think they have some doubt about some of these lower end, fuzzier uses of them, everything from demonstration use to EMP to maybe even very small yield, again, unconventionally delivered types of attacks, all sorts of other uses that could, again, fall into this gray zone of will the U.S. and the U.S. ROC alliance respond or not. And all I would say is, and I don't know exactly, and this is the key, right, what they're thinking, not just what we're thinking. I don't know exactly where they are in that. And what concerns me the most, again, is if I look at particularly the past 20 years of history, I bet you they're looking for that sweet spot. That's my concern. And to the extent they're looking for that sweet spot, their calculations may be different than our calculations. And again, I'll sound like a broken record on this, but that's why we need to start explicitly planning for those and spooling those out and really ensuring we have, as you suggested, a credible response to this. Because right now, if our answer is, you nuke us, we'll nuke you, or you nuke us and we'll roll up the peninsula and take you out, true in some circumstances, but my bet is they believe there's some gap in there somewhere that they can try and slip between. And that's the area I think we all need to pay a lot more attention to.
But, and how about in the meantime, negotiating caps before the numbers themselves become?
Yeah, so I think my strong view would I'd be approaching both the numbers issues, but ideally trying to hit some confidence building measures as well to hit both sides of this to try and maintain some stability in the meantime. You're absolutely right. Once the numbers get to a certain level, in fact, that is the thing that enables the blurring of the lines between Van's options the most, is at a certain number, they can do both. They can afford to use some of them prior to, and not undermine the retaliatory capability, and still retain some for retaliatory capability, which gives them kind of that double whammy piece. So you're absolutely right. Those have to be issues for us going forward.
Remember a couple of years ago, you were saying, well, let them test, great, they'll burn up stuff. But maybe we're not being, let's see a little bit of that.
Yeah, this is the fundamental problem. I've made this case elsewhere, so forgive me, but with the status quo is this trajectory where the arsenal both improves and grows. And that goes on indefinitely, and there's no plan in place that I'm aware of, or that's publicly articulated, that would credibly prevent that from happening. So that just keeps on happening until North Korea decides that it doesn't want to keep doing that anymore. At which point they'll have enough for first and second strike. So.
Jason, thank you. Jason Chan, Yonhap News Agency. The THAAD missile defense issue is such a highly debated issue in Korea, and Dr. Chu already talked about this. And Dr. Jackson, can you also share your view on this issue?
Yeah, I'm surprised that hadn't come up that much prior to this, actually. So this status quo problem that we have, there's nothing stopping it. The minimum necessary sort of prudent condition that we should be pursuing is using operational capabilities to mitigate vulnerabilities. As its nuclear and missile program grows, the vulnerability to U.S. bases in Asia, to South Korea, grows logically. What is the operational counter to prevent that or mitigate that? It's missile defense, principally. And so within certain cost constraints or whatever, the more the better, and being part of an integrated system is optimal, right? And it's not that this is going to solve our problems, but this is kind of like a minimum measure necessary to be able to sleep at night, to know that we're doing something more than nothing about this problem that's getting worse with time.
So, with regard to your questions, well, South Korea cannot go more offensive. In terms of the coping with North Korea's threat. So we have to be defensive. So offensive. Attitude towards North Korea is just escalating the tensions. So what else can we do? That's kind of defensive system. We have to install. That's why the THAAD system we have to understand in this context.
My name is Chet Chunwon newspaper from South Korea. Mr. Jackson, Dr. Jackson, we have a lot of the nuclear threat conveyors, such as drones and missiles, the firefighters. But some Koreans think that THAAD can it protect Korea, South Korea from the lot of North Korean threat? That is just one of the protective ways. But we have not a lot of the threat, such as drones. That is not an anti-treasure for drones. What is your explanation to the South Korean, some South Korean?
So is that THAAD cannot defend, were you saying THAAD cannot defend against drones? That's probably right. At least as far as, I'm not an expert on this, but I think that's probably reasonable. THAAD is the most advanced missile defense system that we have, and the next generation missiles that are coming down the development pipeline, sort of just defense technology, is hypersonic missiles, like extremely high-speed missiles. And THAAD, currently, there is no system that can defend against that. And THAAD is the closest to being able to defend against this next-generation missile threat. And the manufacturer is trying to make adjustments to be able to use THAAD, or an adjusted, recalibrated version of THAAD, to defend against next-generation missiles. So it's not just about dealing with the problem today, but what is possible tomorrow. And the missile defense inventory that South Korea has right now is PAC-3 interceptors, which are extremely limited in terms of range, in terms of the ability to shoot just numbers. South Korea is in a very vulnerable position, and so THAAD can help that. And like Dan was suggesting, interoperability is important. Being part of something that's integrated is important, and THAAD is interoperable with the other systems that the US has, that South Korea has, and dare I say, that Japan has.
Stanley Cover. There's one thing that's never mentioned here. Go back to the Korean War. Kim Il-sung did not launch the attack until he had the approval of both China and the Soviet Union. And he wanted both. China alone was not good enough. I keep hearing these scenarios. But what is the political assumption that North Korea would launch the attack? Somebody mentioned surprise attack. I don't have surprise attack unless it's a surprise to both China and Russia, as well as I just don't understand that. So are we assuming that North Korea would get the approval of China and Russia? Again, that would be something. Or that the North Korean regime would launch the attack in the absence of such an approval? What would be the Chinese reaction then? Would they just sit by? So what are the assumptions with regard to China and Russia?
So, interesting question. In recent years, North Korea hasn't sought or needed prior counsel or approval from either North Korea or from either China, or Russia. The relationship is just fundamentally different than in 1950. Also in 1950, the surprise attack was full-scale invasion, occupation of the peninsula. At least the argument that I'm making is that that's off the table. North Korea doesn't seek that. Most Korea analysts don't think that that's the most likely scenario by any means. But North Korea is also not peace and panda bears. It's still hostile. The relationship that we have with them is still hostile. They have a track record of contemporary violence, and they have capabilities that far exceed what they've done so far. And then in terms of just sheer rhetoric, it's worth what it's worth, but their rhetoric suggests that they have intentions far beyond what they've actually demonstrated to us so far in terms of provocations. And so total war is off the table, I think, but there's still intention and capability for something below that. And the question is just, what does that look like? What are the conditions that trigger that? But one of the concerns I have about, North Korea not having a reliable great power patron is that they don't have to seek approval. So great power involvement can sometimes constrain aggressive behavior by smaller powers historically. But if they don't have a great power patron, then it's harder for great powers to actually play that role.
When it comes to the surprise attack, well, I would like to use a certain analogies. For instance, well, the North Korea's revelation of the possession of nuclear weapons is also kind of surprise to China. And especially the third nuclear test is also kind of something like surprise attack to China. So I think when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, as I already, put the emphasis on the human misjudgment, well, based upon the irrationality of North Korea. So this creates the surprise attacks by North Korea. Even by using nuclear weapons, North Korea doesn't need any approval from Russia or China, I think.
I'll just add to say, I think I agree with both of the other speakers that the context has changed enough. But context has changed enough, and that the concerns I've expressed so far involve actions that may be far below the level that North Korea might even be interested in seeking any outside assistance for. These kinds of provocations appear limited and manageable, but I'm worried could escalate out of control and lead to a situation which, whether they have outside assistance or not, could emerge. But at the same time, I would say we would be foolish if we were not looking at communications between North Korea and China, North Korea and Russia as potential indicators of something happening. So I would hope that that's absolutely one of the at least strategic indicators that we're looking at.
I'll ask another one on the missile defense side, and I want to really direct this to Daniel. You mentioned the phrase defense innovation in terms of your number one recommendation, improve the alliance. Defense innovation is a subset. And connecting that to the missile defense, all this attention on that has the problematic and adverse effect of distracting from the range and spectrum of missiles, low-end artillery to everything else. It has the problem of distracting from that much more complex problem. Saying you actually would not want to, I think, use a THAAD for a UAV, for example. I can't imagine how that would even work. And so therefore, we connect that to the defense innovation. KAMD, but also, what about the prospects of a U.S.-ROC defense cooperation arrangement to produce low-end interceptors? And part that can be directed energy, which allows you to go after the artillery, and to do so in a very cost-effective way. It's a high-tech thing. You can take a look at it. It strikes me as a really high potential, high payoff kind of cooperative agreement. And frankly, it doesn't have the really exotic, closer to strategic level implications that it has.
Yeah, so I completely agree with that. Again, remembering I'm speaking for myself and not for the department here. I think those are exactly the sorts of collaborative efforts we should be going forward with a range of allies and partners around the world, but particularly with the Republic of Korea. And there's a number of reasons for that. One, you correctly point out that it addresses a range or a part of the spectrum of threats that we might not be able to address through existing systems, even the most advanced of our existing systems. The other is I'm a big believer that if even the U.S. is to achieve its defense innovation objectives, that it's going to have to seek inputs from others. Technology is no longer a U.S. monopoly. Technology, more importantly, is not a Department of Defense monopoly. Innovation in that area is going to come from some sort of collaborative effort, probably involving non-defense entities and probably involving non-U.S. entities. And so I think pulling the ROC into that collaborative arrangement to address these issues is absolutely the right way forward, both for the ROC, for the U.S., and for the U.S.-ROC alliance. On THAAD, I think it's, there's a complicated, I've used the word balance a lot in my discussion, and I think it's, again, a complicated balance. Van is right, THAAD is important for addressing an important range of threats. They are certainly not the only range of threats, so if we overinvest or we overfocus in that area, we create some risks for ourselves. On the other hand, if we underinvest and underexamine that area, we also create risk for ourselves, and as you know, it's one of those damned if you do, damned if you don't moments. You overdo it and people think you're overplaying that aspect of it. You underdo it and they question your credibility and commitment in those areas. So while I recognize to some this is an unsatisfying answer, I think the correct answer is to find the right balance between these efforts, both from an investment standpoint and a level of effort standpoint. But I couldn't agree more strongly with what you're suggesting. And one more broken record moment, and the only way to highlight those requirements that would then drive that kind of collaboration is to have the planning scenarios on hand to say, and look, here's how those requirements would play. Again, as long as we consider these sorts of things lesser included, we won't see the specific requirements for those, and it'd be very hard to drive that kind of collaborative process.
Then you want to add something?
I would just like the head nod. I agree.
Yeah, with regard to Tom and Dan's point about the collaboration with regard to the between U.S. and Korea. You know, when U.S. initiated the collaboration with Japan on missile defense, at least for research and development, the Korean government was hesitant to be part of that process, mainly because at the time Korean government did not want to recognize North Korea, and also did not want to recognize geostrategically China. So do you think now that kind of discussion about, since we know that this deployment of that to the USFK itself causes this much trouble for China, then do you think that China would believe that this kind of collaboration will not target them?
So again, what I'd say, pursuant to the conversation we just had, is this shouldn't just be about that or not that. This should be a much broader discussion. I would hope that we can work collaboratively, because we know under these circumstances that integrated interoperable systems are far more effective than separate standalone systems. That creates a necessity for us. For China, to the extent that they're concerned with this type of collaboration, my strong priority with them would be to help us resolve the situation. If we can resolve the situation, the need for this type of collaboration is diminished, and their concern with it will be likewise diminished. And if they want to work with us to help resolve the missile threat from North Korea, they're absolutely welcome to do that.
Thank you very much, Bill Newcomb. I've listened to all of you all with a lot of interest, but I must admit that my attention was sort of seized and focused on this whole notion of limited war. And it looks to me, if you're going to examine that scenario, it's high risk, low reward, because neither party can afford to be the loser politically. Because if the North Korean military lost a limited war, not only with the generals, but the regime loses all credibility. So they must win. If Seoul loses a limited war, then the Seoul military and its administration is totally discredited. So they cannot afford, once engaged, to lose. So for both sides, they're into a high-risk situation. So rather than be focused on a nuclear deterrent, I think that the most logical next step to, let's say they parachute on an island or whatever, the next thing it goes chemical. And North Korea possesses the chemical. What this escalation of other WMD has not been discussed. And I wish you would comment on that a little bit. And the why limited war? Why do you think that's a possibility when the outcomes are not necessarily optimal for either party? Thank you.
I'll let Van defend the limited war idea. It's why, though, and I actually think we may be talking about similar things using slightly different terminology, but what you just expressed is exactly why I've actually emphasized rather than limited war, which seems like going into something with the expectation that it will be at a certain level and maintained at that level. My concern is primarily with provocations leading to unintended escalation. Now, that could lead to something that looks like what Van is talking about as limited war, but the difference is in terms of intentions and expectations. I'm extremely concerned that the view is provocations can somehow be limited and managed. But I am also extremely concerned that exactly the dynamics you discussed will lead to uncontrolled escalation or difficult to control escalation, which could then spin up much higher than either side had anticipated initially. So I do think that's the area to be extremely concerned about. I think that can look a lot like what Dan is talking about in terms of limited war, as opposed to full-scale invasion, no full-scale invasion, which was our previous paradigm. But
Yeah, so, I mean, excellent question, and Dan's totally right. So the limited war, the most likely pathway is, in my mind at least, the provocation, the expectation by either side that it can be managed, and then retaliation leading to escalation. Like, this is a very sort of plausible pathway to get into a scenario where suddenly parts of the KPA feel that they should be proposing to Kim Jong-un that they should launch a limited ground campaign or to set up a blockade of Northwest Island or whatever. But in the context of South Korea or the US has violated historical precedent by retaliating or whatever, it's quite plausible that North Korea would then suggest either responding in kind or ratcheting it up, and so you very quickly end up in a limited war scenario. There's also like a separate possibility that North Korea makes some kind of discrete calculation. If I do a limited land grab across the DMZ and hold it, I can bargain it away. So it's like the nuclear program becomes a separate issue. So these are all hypotheticals, but the point is that they're not impossible. And that as North Korea's nuclear program improves, their ability or their reasonable level of confidence that retaliation won't happen should logically increase, which is more worrisome if we're in a bad state of relations with them. So limited war, yeah, high risk. That's one of the reasons why we should be focusing on it, I think.
We see Putin doing this now, right? Threatening the Norwegians, is it, with nuclear war if they, if they worry about what's happening in the country. Come on,
Question, Mr. Chu. You mentioned more European engagement in Northeast Asia. What, do you have in mind the general interest or more active diplomacy or military contribution of the UN military command? And given European disinclination to do anything that would displace the Chinese, would introducing European diplomacy create a stronger alliance or just one more break?
So I think it will be a matter of diplomacy as opposed to military forces, hopefully. And I do think this is the way I've characterized it, which I think is important, is adding more voices to the discussion of norms of behavior and international rules and laws. I think that can be done in a way that Europeans should be comfortable with in not antagonizing partners in the region. And I think that can be more effective than making this a purely US ROC-centric discussion. So to me, this is an additional, more complementary effort. I'm not arguing this is a magic solution, but I do think the discussion needs to be broadened to a broader audience. The Europeans have strong interests in stability in the region and a strong concern with what North Korea is doing. For the most part, they have left that to the United States and to the Republic of Korea to deal with fairly autonomously. I think it is time to recognize the global impacts of what North Korea is doing in the region and provide a global position on this as much as possible.
Can I jump in discussions on the European role? Well, actually, if you look at the six-party talks comparing to the Iranian deals, Iranian nuclear deals, there's one missing point. There's no intervention of the European countries in the nuclear negotiations with North Korea. So that's why people are suspicious about the fact that North Korean nuclear issue is regionalized rather than considering as global issue. Another important point at the European role is that I think, European countries tends to be very neutral about the, geopolitics in on the Korean Peninsula. So we can make good use of this kind of, nature of the European countries. For instance, European countries can play a significant role as a honest broker between North and South Korea. Dr. Cho already mentioned, confidence building measures is really important in reducing the tensions. But unfortunately, between North and South Korea, there is no confidence building. So, in that sense, any kind of, acts of provocations would be misled or misinterpreted with each other. In that sense, I think North Korea is always playing with symmetry. In order to dominate the escalation of tensions. So, in that sense, some people just mentioned China and Russia may significant play in raising the confidence building with North Korea. I don't think so. European countries would do that.
European countries can also play a role in how China and Russia play a role in the situation on the peninsula. The one thing I would just add is it wasn't long ago when I, at least in my experience, would talk to European countries about Asia Pacific, and the response I got quite clearly and bluntly was Asia Pacific is the U.S.'s problem, Europe will focus elsewhere. I don't get that response anymore when I talk to Europeans. There's a strong interest and concern with what's going on in the Asia Pacific region, and a strong interest in how to be constructively involved. All you have to do is run, some fairly simple numbers, as I'm sure everybody in this room can imagine, that what the impact on the global economy would be of even a fairly minor disruption on the Korean Peninsula, given supply chains, given manufacture, given the range of sectors, economic sectors that support key economic growth and stability. It will affect everybody, and the Europeans are well aware of that. And so the question is how to best join forces on that. And it doesn't necessarily mean getting the Europeans to steam their navy over to the Pacific. It may very well mean getting them to join in vocally and forcefully on issues where we believe that we need broad international consensus with regard to international norms and laws.
One last question.
Hi, my name is Jun from the Heritage Foundation. Can I have two questions, or I'll make it short? Okay. My first question is to Dr. Jackson. As you said, that the current administration's strategic patience is like a clever way of saying doing nothing. I partly agree with you. Like guys like Bruce Klinger have also said that current administration is not putting their sanctions to the fullest. So, I believe the key point of the dealing with the North Korean nuclear is how we can actually incapacitate them, because we tried to have them give up themselves, but it didn't work. So there's alternatives, that is one of them, and and there are conventional financial sanctions, and some experts even talk about the deployment of U.S. nuclear in the Korean Peninsula. So I would just want to hear from you, what do you think is the most effective alternative in incapacitating the nuclear power in North? And for Dr. Chu, I want to raise the point about the importance of a trilateral alliance in the region, between U.S., Japan, and Korea. You said that you should continue to improve U.S. allies. And I believe the one purpose of the pivot is actually to enhance the pre-existing U.S. allies into a network, but it seems like it's not really working that well. I get the notion that there is virtually nothing going on between Japan and Korea, and I think U.S. is not actually actively taking its role as a mediator. And for Koreans, when it comes to military matters with Japan, like they showed in Jisomia, or the controversy over rights of collective self-defense. I just want to hear your opinion on that issue.
Yeah, for your information, he's been working at had teach for like 3 months.
I read the same stuff.
Yeah. Good questions, though. So, on the question of deploying nukes back to the peninsula, nothing's impossible. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think deploying nukes to the peninsula would actually add a layer of deterrence or change North Korea's psychology at all. They already think we're so hostile just when we're doing annual habitual exercises, right? So the hostility sponge is fully saturated at this point. And so deploying nukes, it's almost like rubbing, it's maybe it makes us feel good, but it may just be antagonistic without adding deterrence value. Could be wrong. Sanctions, I question, I understand Bruce has said, among others, that we could be doing a lot more on sanctions. He's probably right, but I think even if we pushed it to the maximum limit, I doubt it's going to change North Korea's calculations. And so sanctions matter for reasons of symbolism, if not, efficacy or changing calculations. And then what else works? This is why missile defense is so meaningful. Before I joined, full disclosure, before I joined the Pentagon years ago, I was on record as being very much against missile defense because of its cost, because of its effectiveness or non-effectiveness or unprovenness. And it's not that those things are untrue today. It's still expensive. It's still largely unproven. But it's also one of the least sort of provocative or antagonistic things that you can do to mitigate vulnerability. And to the extent that we're facing a very serious problem with North Korea that gets worse over time, it's kind of like this is the least we can do. That's kind of my perspective, but it's not a panacea, right? So there are a lot more things that need to be done. There's a range of threats. I think I addressed.
So just a few thoughts from my perspective. First of all, I don't particularly agree that the term strategic patience means doing nothing. I do think sometimes we need to recognize there's a longer term game to be played, and it's important to play that game while playing the near term piece. This goes back to my balancing of near term and longer term objectives. I recognize that the long term game is not well mapped out here. I think that could be done better, including on the sanctions front. Let's face it, North Korea is under the most severe sanctions of any country on the planet, and yet has continued to survive and in some bizarre ways thrive over time. So the real question is not just sanctions or no sanctions, but what we're actually going to do with regard to enforcement of those sanctions. And this I will bring back to whether more voices will help in that situation or not. I don't know the actual answer, but I think those are the sorts of conversations we need to be having. On deployment of nukes or other strike capabilities to offensively take out North Korean capabilities, again, I'll say, without deployment of anything, we can offensively take out North Korean capabilities. But the question is, do we have a credible way of doing so? Once upon a time, this kind of tit-for-tat view of nuclear weapons prevailed. If they have this kind of nuclear weapon, we have to have this kind of nuclear weapon in an effort to create some kind of strategic parity and balance in the Cold War context. Some are arguing for that today. I've even seen some people say, the Russians have tactical nuclear artillery, and so we should reintroduce tactical nuclear artillery into Europe. I don't think that makes any sense under the current context. The old Cold War dyadic relationship is gone. This is a much more multifaceted and multidimensional kind of problem. So that I agree with Van. I'm not sure deployment of these types of capabilities would be enhance stability. I actually worry they'd undermine stability quite significantly. On the trilateral point, I will just give you my impression. And remember, my vantage point, even when I was in government, was from a broad strategy perspective. I was not on the desk. I did not do the regional issues. But from my broad perspective, the point you made about enhancing trilateral relations is the point I made over and over and over and over again when I visited the region, and even when I wasn't visiting the region. We put extreme is probably not the right word, but we put a lot of effort into trying to make that relationship not only work, but work better. I remember when I was in Korea, the announcement made by the heads of state in, I can't remember where it was, in Brussels or somewhere on the sidelines of another meeting that was happening on, I think, a G8 meeting that was intended to spur US, ROC, and Japan trilateral activities, and frankly has not resulted in a lot since then. So bottom line is I agree with you. It's going to be imperative on all three parties to overcome past obstacles, or at least seek to resolve them as we move forward in this kind of trilateral alliance. I absolutely agree that we will be stronger together, not only on North Korea issues, but on regional issues if we work together. This idea of collaboration and innovation, likewise, will be enhanced if we work together. I think there are numerous opportunities for us to not only move that trilateral effort forward, but really numerous imperatives for us to move that trilateral effort forward. So I hope the feeling is as strong back in Korea, and likewise in Japan, we'll find some opportunity to move that forward in the near future.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. It's already time to wrap up, and please join me in thanking all the speakers today.